Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. Today I have a new guest, Venus Upadhyaya, an investigative journalist joining us for the first time. Venus, welcome to PGurus channel.
Hello, thank you.
So Venus, I want to just give a quick introduction about you to our viewers. Venus is based in the United States and she is an investigative journalist. And we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, and that of Confucianism, Confucius, what it has, what are the institutes that are doing it, what is its impact on the current situation vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis Galvan, and a few other things. So please stay tuned for a riveting discussion. But before we jump into our topic of the day, Venus, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you studied, where you're born, and what are you doing right now?
I was born in Jammu, very interestingly. I was not born very far away from the border. My ancestors are from a village in Kathua, so in the Himalayas. And I grew up, missed that conflict. I grew up listening to stories about war and conflicts and watching a lot of army convoys around us and even being a witness to bombings and stuff like that. So I had that inquisitiveness to understand the world and why I was living in a conflict zone and what conflict means. And that's how I became a journalist. I studied journalism in Bangalore. And for about a decade, I worked around different parts of the country in different capacities and as a journalist as well. And right now I am in DC. I'm a reporter. I report on international affairs with the Epoch Times.
Wonderful. And today we're going to talk about the Chinese philosopher Confucius. He's believed to have lived somewhere around 551 BCE to about 471 or something thereabouts. And he is supposed to have founded some schools and so on and so forth. The interesting thing is Confucius and Confucianism has been a part of the Chinese culture for all these years. Now we are talking about 2,500 years. Perhaps for our viewers' benefit, you can summarize what is Confucianism. I know he talks about filial values, virtuosity, and also respect to our elders, more or less what Sanatanis believe in too. So perhaps you can bring in a little bit more about Confucianism. What is it and how is it being applied in the present day context?
Okay. Confucius was a philosopher. We can say that he was a saint. And as you said, he is someone who has had a lot of influence on the way the Chinese, before the communism took over China, the thought, their thought process, their thought about themselves, their thoughts about morality, their thoughts about society were heavily influenced by Confucianism. I think what's very important for us to understand is what happened from 1966 to 1976 when the Cultural Revolution happened. And at that time, Confucianism, or the era, or the entire ideology of Confucius, was basically denounced, and it was heavily targeted and attacked in the sense that the temples with Confucius ideals were attacked, and the scholars or the people who revered Confucius were also targeted. They were jailed, and some of them were also pushed to suicide. And I think that's the important context in which we have to talk about what today means the Confucius Institutes.
How many institutes of this kind are there all over the world? And perhaps then we can hone in on three countries: United States, India, and Australia.
There are about 1,700 of them.
Wow.
According to Doris Liu, who is basically a filmmaker who recently made a film and whom I have interviewed. She made a film called In the Name of Confucius, and actually people can go on that website, search for In the Name of Confucius, and you can actually watch this film. And she says there are about 1,700 of them in 162 countries. Now, there are two kinds of them, one which exists in colleges and universities, and then there is some Confucius learning, which the Chinese government promotes globally at the school level as well.
Now, there's a conflict that I see. Communism says there is no God, there's no culture, and so on and so forth. Yet the same Communist Party, CCP, is now promoting Confucius teaching. Do you see the conflict in that, and why did they choose to do this?
I think it's a very interesting and a very valid question, and rightly put. Uh, that's the whole thing. That's the irony. On one side, the Chinese government during the Cultural Revolution attacked Confucianism, and on the other side, the Chinese government uses the name of Confucius to brand itself and brand its ideology. But basically, what the experts are saying and what the researchers and investigators are saying, that it's under the garb of the Confucius Institutes that the Chinese regime, it basically promotes its communist agenda.
So what you're saying is it's not what it seems like, that there is something underneath the currents are flowing. Now, Venus, before we delve into more deep depth about Confucianism, there has been talk that Galwan figures in all of this. Perhaps you could clue in our viewers on how the Galwan conflict and Confucianism and CCP come to play together.
Again, thank you for asking this question. We have to keep in mind that there are about 7 Confucius institutes in 7 universities across India, and there are about 154 MOUs that various Indian universities and educational institutions have with some Chinese establishment for it, and this is not new. So that means the Confucius Institutes were existing even before. They have been existing since years. So what changed? It's the Galwan that changed India's outlook towards China, and it's somewhere it woke us up and said, no, we cannot take this lightly. The Chinese are very aggressive, and they talk something, but they do something, and we need to. That's what experts are saying, that India now wants to be more assertive, and we are not going to consider the Chinese sensitivities on international platforms, and we are going to hit the Chinese where it hurts them the most, and that is their brand image and their global image. And Confucius Institutes are a part of that image.
That's very interesting. And now, if you take a look at these institutes, I think the United States is now starting to clamp down on these institutes, especially in the United States. They are saying that these institutes should start considering themselves as diplomatic missions. In other words, they will fall under the same rules as applied to, say, a consulate of China in San Francisco. So that means the United States is sort of tightening its monitoring of what happens in Confucius Institutes and what is coming out. So do you think the United States now thinks it knows what these institutes are up to and it is trying to clip their wings?
Yeah, in fact, I think the Chinese, the American government, the current government is actually taking a note of that. But again, in US also, this is not a new phenomena. There is a report that already exists by Rachel Peterson, and she's a senior research fellow at the National Association of Scholars. Probably in the comments to this video, I can later share the link of this report, and it talks about. This report is called Outsourced to China, Confucius Institutes and Soft Power in American Higher Education. And I recently interviewed Peterson, and she told me that in US and across about 45 Confucius Institutes are closed. So National Association of Scholars actually keeps a track of the Confucius Institutes that are being closed or that are being investigated.
So for viewers, if you want to send in your questions, please feel free to do so. And also, I hope you're subscribing to our channel. Venus, the next question I have is, I've lived about half my life in, I'll give you a chance to explain.
Yeah, sure.
1 second.
Sure.
Maybe you should finish your thought and then I'll ask you the question. Go ahead.
Okay. No, I also wanted to point out there's something very interesting which Doris pointed out. And she talked about how Confucius Institutes they censor and breach academic freedom. And she gave the example of how Confucius Institute's teachers and students were required to watch the Chinese Communist Party's 19th National Congress and study Chinese leader Xi Jinping's opening remarks, including the One Belt, One Road initiative. And she gave the example of a Punjabi Confucius Institutes in Pakistan, as well as a Confucius classroom in Angkor High School in Cambodia. And basically, there are many other interesting examples of how these Confucius institutes then also, push the agenda of the CCP. For example, she talks about there has been an incident earlier in the past when these Confucius institutes meddled, and Dalai Lama was about to give a speech somewhere, and then they didn't let that happen. And there was another incident when in Israel there was a university which was actually to show an exhibition about this persecuted spiritual group called Falun Gong, and then through the Confucius Institutes they also shut that down.
But Falun Gong is essentially Buddhist thought, right? I mean, so are they saying that Confucian and Buddhism are sort of related?
No, it's not about linking that. See, the Confucius Institutes are basically a platform. They are a space that the Chinese regime uses to push its agendas. So if the Chinese regime doesn't like something, or it is persecuting something within the Chinese mainland, it will push the same agenda through the Confucius Institutes in other countries. So if the Chinese government doesn't like Falun Gong, then the Chinese government, suppose a Falun Gong exhibition or a Falun Gong lecture or something is happening somewhere, or suppose a Dalai Lama lecture is happening somewhere in the vicinity of a Confucius Institutes, then it tries to use its soft powers, its links and its networks to pressurize and, just try that doesn't happen.
That's very interesting observation you made. Most of these things, free speech, liberalism, usually they will start taking root from Europe, especially Western Europe. How is Confucianism seen in Western Europe? And are they also acting on these institutes?
I am not really well versed about what's happening with Confucius Institutes in Western Europe. So I would not be really able to, give you a clear picture of that. And my knowledge and understanding is limited to the stories that I have been working on. But there is one point that I want to really emphasize here in context of Galwan and in context of where we are placed in India, and this is something which all the experts have told me, is that after Galwan happened, what happens is most of the governments in the world, why they're becoming very concerned about Confucius Institutes, because they're also linked with the Chinese spies. So if the Confucius Institutes are linked with the Chinese government, they become spaces where the Chinese government can push its agendas through. So whether that is, spying or using activities to kind of, those kind of activities. So what Doris told me, that one thing we have to note as Indians is that it's very important to review the Confucius Institutes post-Galwan, because that's the time when the India-China relationship is very strained. So that's the time when there is a need for more spying. So obviously you have to curtail and review the spaces where more spying activities can happen. And that's what the Indian government is doing, basically.
So the one thing that we have noticed in India is that there appears to be an implicit link between the left, the Islamists, and these Chinese-funded organizations. And I don't know if you saw this recently. India shut down a company that had close to 1,000 crores of investment through shell companies, and they shut down this whole operation. So there is a deep infiltration, at least in India, with the left and Islamists of the Chinese bodies. Is this something, a pattern that you see played out in the rest of the world, or is it just localized to India?
It is played in rest of the world. It is in fact played everywhere. And this is something very concerning. I've been just today writing another story on, on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And I'm bringing that into this topic because we have to also, see how the Chinese are working, the Chinese regime is working around the world on its expansionist agenda. And there are, I think the viewers would be knowing that there are about 14 Pacific islands to the east of Australia. And all these islands are under massive debt of the Chinese regime. And so now there is a threat, the Australians have a threat that if the Chinese take over these islands, they're going to change the entire policy of these nations. So therefore, it's a direct threat to the Australians. And now this is just one example. Even if you look at the One Belt, One Road project around the world, you can find many analyses online which talk about, how this is very good and this is leading to development, this is leading to this and that. But it's actually very concerning because the countries are given loans and the loans they are not able to pay back the loans. And you look at what's happening in Hong Kong, the Chinese have gone back on their promise. So it's like the Chinese regime always promised something, but when it goes to doing something, it always pushes its agenda. And it's about its agenda of expansionism. I think Indians should be very concerned about things that are happening in Nepal, how the Chinese are playing on our western frontier in Pakistan. Recently, Chinese government has decided to give about $1 billion to develop the Trista River project in Bangladesh. And so these are not small occurrences. I think it's high time that India wakes up to the Chinese regime's agenda.
Venus, I want to ask you a question specific to Bangladesh. Supposedly, Bangladesh is growing very fast now. In fact, their GDP per capita is better than they've even crossed Pakistan. And yet we see all these huge funding coming into China, to Bangladesh, before that to Sri Lanka, and then Nepal, and so on. Why is it that suddenly all these governments feel the need for external cash influx?
See, I mean, this is limited to my perception. It's like, and the stories that I'm doing is that everybody wants development. All the nations want development. And it seems that the Chinese regime is there, which is there and saying, okay, yes, we are ready to give you funding. You just look at recently, Sri Lanka is getting $500 million for COVID response from China. So I think it's somewhere the world also has to look into why these small nations are looking towards China rather than, looking towards the other countries. But I think somewhere we also need to look deeply into US Indo-Pacific policy. And I think there are many linkages over there, things that US is doing to strengthen the democratic institutions in various countries in the Indo-Pacific, in the small countries. And if we go through that policy, we will understand why that is the Indo-Pacific policy is very important to counter China in the Indo-Pacific, because the things China is doing are very, very concerning. And these things are going to happen, things happening in Hong Kong, and like recently what happened in Galwan. And now imagine if Galwan wouldn't have happened, we would have continued, the same way that we had since so long.
Absolutely. In fact, that was a turning point. The fact that India was the first to ban 59 apps of Chinese origin is a landmark event. In fact, even as we speak, Microsoft and a few other companies are trying to buy the assets of TikTok in the United States. After all, TikTok is nothing but YouTube in a slightly modified form, but yet, this is what it is. And so once you have a customer base, and that is something that attracts eyeballs for these big companies. One small observation, Venus. I'm reading that the United States has now placed a ban on the entire CCP top leadership from getting into India. It's sort of like the ban that was imposed on Narendra Modi by United Kingdom in 2004, 2005, for about 7, 8, 9 years or something like that. So there are some significant moves that the United States is making now. Now, do you think the rest of the countries will follow that and try to make it difficult for the Chinese leadership to be able to travel, assuming that post-corona things come back to a certain amount of normalcy and that travel is sort of at 50% of what it used to be?
See, the Chinese regime doesn't understand democratic language. Their ethics and principles are not governed by democracy. So I think the US, they have understood, and India has understood, that if we talk to Chinese like this, maybe they're going to, say a yes, but then they're going to go about doing their own things. And that's where I think the US is becoming more assertive against the Chinese leadership. And I think that's where India is also becoming more assertive. Just look at Galwan, this kind of primitive weapons they have used, like medieval weapons. I mean, experts tell me that this is not expected from a professional army. This is just against all kind of professional ethics. And then the attack has happened when a commanding officer has gone for negotiations. So it's a real breach of trust. Who would do that? In modern humanity, I think it's an example, and that's why everyone is saying, if you look at recent statements that are coming from US, that they're saying that we need to note, the world needs to note, that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is not an army that belongs to a nation. It's an army that belongs to a political party. It's an army that belongs to the Chinese Communist Party. And it's the only army in the world that doesn't belong to a nation but belongs to a party.
So how do we make things happen? How do we make things change in the inside China? Because they have a vice-like grip on what the population sees about how it is being talked about outside of China. So how does one bring about change?
I think it's a very valid question, but it's a very tough question for me to answer, being an Indian. But I do see, many rays of hopes. Like, there are things happening inside China. There are people protesting inside China. Um, for example, you look at the Falun Gong practitioners. They have been persecuted for about more than 2 decades, but still, you know, I mean, they have put up a brave front. You look at various other groups, you look at the Christian groups that are being persecuted within China. There are still people who are persecuted within China, but they are refusing to let go of their faiths. They're refusing to follow what the Chinese Communist Party is asking them to follow. You look at the example of Taiwan, you look at the protests that are happening in Hong Kong. And I think there are a lot of other incidents around the country where people are waking up. Like, there were protests against the Confucius Institutes within Canada, and the film, on the name of Confucius, is basically based on a few case stories of people who worked with the Confucius Institutes and then came out and then started to talk about of kind of activities these institutes are involved in. So all these little stories of people standing up against the agendas of the Chinese Communist Party are basically a ray of hope.
That was very revealing and refreshing to know. Venus, I'm going to ask you this last question, and then
Sure.
afterwards we'll throw open the floor for questions. What message would you like to give to all the democratic nations across the world on how to counter this Confucius and how to counter the CCP ideology slowly, coming from underneath and taking ground? I can tell you one data point. As far as I know, a lot of Chinese American kids, they actually learn language Chinese. They can speak, read, write Chinese from a very young age. I would not say the same of, say, Indian Americans. Indian American, because of our native language, some will learn one, some will learn the other. There's no uniformity. Whereas somehow I see that the Chinese kids, they're all, taught Chinese at a very young age. They may not be able to speak it fluently, but when they grow up, but they always know what the parent is saying, 90 to 95% of it. I'm not saying the Indian American children don't. It is just that it's not so consistent, because if you want to try and propagate a message, and if it were to be done in a language other than English, you get my point.
I think it's a perception. I actually don't agree with it, because if we talk about that China is, you know, there's a way that the Chinese regime is, I won't say China, but I would say Chinese regime is educating its young people, its children. I would also say we need to look into how the Chinese Communist Party exists. It exists right from the kindergarten. So, if you become a party, or if you become a part of the Chinese Communist Party, there is something that you join when you are in the kindergarten, then there's something you join when you are at the school level, then at the college level. So it progresses like that. Now, is that the kind of education we want to give to our young people, to our children? And that's the concerns of the Confucius Institutes, because the agenda which the Chinese Communist Party is working with in the mainland and indoctrinating its people, the same agenda the Chinese Communist Party has through the Confucius Institutes around the globe. So I think my thoughts are that the best thing is to strengthen the educational the democratic institutions existing at the grassroots level, to build and to build on the democratic values of our people, and to strengthen our democratic institutions. And I think that's what the nations of the world, particularly the United States and India, which are two largest democracies in the world, have to think about. How do we work? It's very concerning. Just look at the example of Myanmar. It's a very young democracy, and this young democracy should be under the influence of more India and US. Whereas you look at the way the Chinese are meddling in the internal politics of Myanmar, for that matter.
You are absolutely spot on, and it's just that this adventurism on part of China has not been matched or countered by the immediate neighbor India, and you see all these things. I think India is also getting a grip of this thing now, because you saw yesterday the Sri Lankan Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa giving a very pro-India stance, taking a very pro-India stance, and so there is some work that is being done by the Modi government to try and gain some ground back. Let's hope that this continues, and let's hope that we want something. We want the truth to prevail, and I think that is what everyone is after. And I think from that point of view, this conversation has been completely fascinating, because we have never covered something like this ever in our Hangout. So thank you very much, Venus, for sharing your thoughts on Confucianism and the CCP's Confucius University. So I'm going to start asking questions from our viewers. The first question is from Bhaskar Datta. Which are the institutes, universities in India which have Confucius Institute link?
Okay, see, there are about 7 of them. I won't be able to give you, a list of all the 7. They're not on my fingertips, but I can tell you the 2 of them which are under hard review right now. One is in Mumbai and one is in Vellore.
Okay. Sarvesh Janoti wants to know, One Belt, One Road, is it an economically smart idea for the CCP, or will it lead to their downfall?
I mean, this is something which the future will show, but it's surely a very threatening concept. It's basically, I see it as a communist agenda of taking over the whole world. We should look into what a nation has to sign when a nation becomes a part of the One Belt, One Road project. The nations, the countries that become a part of it, they have to, these contracts, these associations between China and the hosting country, it governs everything right to the point media can talk about One Belt, One Road project in that country. So it kind of determines the behavior of the host country. Why are people talking about Pakistan as becoming a Chinese colony these days? The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor project, which is a part of the One Belt, One Road project, is one of the most expensive projects of the One Belt, One Road project. Now, what does it mean when so much of money is being pushed into Pakistan? And One Belt, One Road project, we need to understand when these projects happen, it is not that the host country is provided employment. The Chinese companies come with their own workers.
Oh yes, I've dealt at length with this, especially in the Gilgit-Baltistan area, where they have a complete enclave of Chinese occupying there. Even the signs inside the enclave are in Chinese. So essentially, they have established a Chinese small property area inside of the Gilgit city. So these are happening, and I can't say that Pakistanis are happy about it. So we have to try and see when.
Yeah, again,
Go ahead.
Yeah, we have to try and see, like I went to Sri Lanka and I was having a conversation with my driver, and this is what my driver told me. He said, it's like, okay, you see this Chinese company comes, they bring in their own employees. We have a work time, we work from say morning 9 to evening 5. The Chinese will start to work very early morning, they're going to work like late. They they're just going to finish the project in a short time, and when they leave they would have changed the entire culture. They're not sensitive to our culture, they're not sensitive to the way I live. So people in the host countries at many places are not happy.
This is actually echoing. I've had other people from other countries also join our hangouts, and they've expressed similar thoughts. Now,
Yes.
one of the risks, in my opinion, that China carries is that you see, when you build an infrastructural project in a different country, and if that country reneges on its commitments, your military is not strong enough to go and subdue it. It may be able to do it for a small country, but even Pakistan, if China were to try and force Pakistanis to try and toe their line, they will find it very difficult because the Chinese army was shown for what it was in Galwan. I mean, it's right now it's a huge credibility problem for China. They can have 1 million people in its army, but the rank and file don't see the quality that is expected to go and fight wars. You see, China has not really indulged in any warfare in many, many years. Whereas India, Pakistan, everybody, they're having local skirmishes all the time. So they are war, battle ready soldiers, and China doesn't have that. So I have a real concern about that as to how much of Galvan has really dented them in terms of like what they come across to all these countries. So do you think there could be some, showing of spine by some of these signatories?
It's a very difficult question for me to answer, basically. But I can only say that the Chinese act multidimensionally. So if the Chinese are attacking, then it's not that they are confronting a particular nation continentally, on the border, or on the maritime border. The Chinese are working within the countries. All the products that they're selling you, we are, by buying the Chinese products, we are feeding the Chinese economy. So, and then this is not a new incident. The world has just started to, comprehend what the Chinese are doing to the Chinese regime is doing to the whole world. But I think it's somewhere to understand how to work on this economically, and how do we stop feeding into the Chinese economic, story, and how do we become more sustainable and more independent of that. For example, there's something is coming to my mind I wanted to mention. So I did a story on the boycott that the Chinese are facing within India after Galwan. And there is a 16-year-old I interviewed who has developed a platform called Swaraj Tech. So he told me, you see, he said, in school, you know, children or students are all using Chinese apps. And I wanted to create an alternate platform where the students can go and instead use Indian apps, because he was very inspired by, this boycott movement that was initiated after Galwan. So he's come up with this lovely platform called Swaraj Tech, and people can look for it on Twitter. And it, starting from apps, now it started to list down all the products, right from televisions to ACs to all the other gadgets, that instead of buying the Chinese product, you can look for the Indian alternatives. So I was talking with a lot of people in India about it, and people said that, okay, we need to boycott Chinese products, but it's like an emotional hype. Okay, boycott, and there's some campaign, and there's some pictures clicking, and there's a buzz on the media. Then what after that? We are still buying the Chinese products, right? Because the economy is being fed on it, our homes are being fed on it. So where do we need to make a change? People who are actually working on the ground said, we need to make a change. We need to sustain the production in our towns and cities and villages. And that's where we need to start. Otherwise, what is the actual meaning of boycotting Chinese products? You burn something, you burn some goods somewhere on the roadside, take a picture and show it in the media. That doesn't mean a boycott, because eventually things are just going to go back to square one. That's why I mentioned this initiative, Swaraj Tech. It's very small, but by a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old, but it means taking some concrete actions.
Absolutely. And that was a fascinating story you just shared with us. This is the last question for today. Gangadhar Anupoj wants to know, why are Indians and the United States so reactive and not proactive that it has to take a Galwan for them to take note?
I think it's an interesting question. I think we all needed Galwan to wake up. Indian establishment needed Galwan to wake up. You know, it's after Galwan that our entire foreign policy has changed. And people tell me that, experts tell me from New Delhi that, you know, India and China have become sworn enemies. And, you know, we are not going to be friends in the next 2 decades, which means that India will not support China on international platforms. Now, what this would actually mean and what kind of a foreign policy would this design and sustain is something we need to look into. Yeah, but I think this kind of discussions are very healthy and we need to keep thinking and keep asking questions and keep on doing things like Swaraj Tech to be able to, you know, work on something concrete. You know, yes, the government is working on the foreign policy, but the people also need to do something concrete.
Thank you so much, Venus. This was a fantastic session. Viewers, on a final note, I want to let you know that a lot of news is now coming about vaccines and their efficiencies. So I think we may have turned the corner on COVID. Just stay tuned. We'll give you more information. Venus, it was a pleasure having you on our platform, and we hope to have you back again very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure here too. Thank you.
Namaskar.